Coming up next, CityNet 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
He didn't walk out and protest. He'll be back. On Friday, May the 26th, join us for a program on the subject of patients' rights with the President of the American Medical Association, Dr. Thomas Reardon. The meeting will be here at the Multnomah Athletic Club. On Friday, June the 2nd, is our annual meeting and election of officers. Our speaker that day will be Governor Gary Locke of Washington, and our own Governor Kitzhaber will introduce him. It'll be at the Multnomah Athletic Club. Our member host today is Jane Seast of the Research Board and chair of the information report on listing of salmon on the endangered species list. She will ask the first question. Other questions from the floor can be asked, or if you have one you'd like to put in writing, do so and raise your hand, and a staff member will bring it up to the forefront. The broadcast of the City Club programs this quarter are made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Portland General Electric, Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt, and Weyerhaeuser Company Foundation. We're very grateful for their support. In introducing the speakers today, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the passing of Ken Spees this week. Ken was a longtime supporter of improvement in water quality with the State Sanitary Authority, and then was the first head of the Department of Environmental Quality. As we will hear today, salmon recovery is more than water quality. But when the dissolved oxygen in the Willamette River approached zero, it became a critical element, and Ken played a key role in river improvements for over 40 years. Bill Derry is a senior consultant with CH2M Hill in Seattle. He's currently working with the Tri-County area of Seattle on Endangered Species Act issues. He's been responsible for background papers on exciting topics such as urban issues and stormwater, adaptive management, and the science behind the 65% forest cover and 10% impervious area limitations. Good stuff for your evening reading. Bill has been working for King County on developing cooperative interagency approaches to watershed management for the last 6 years, and the three-county area on ESA response strategies. He's a graduate of the University of Washington in forestry. David Bragdon is the presiding officer of the Metro Council here in Portland. That's a full-time job, and even then, and more than that, to deal, in fact, with some of the other council members. David comes with a background of education and government out of Harvard, not Reed, and worked with Nike, Lasco Shipping, Evergreen International, and a local port authority. Rob Drake has been mayor of Beaverton since 1993. In that position, he serves as chief executive officer for the city. Rob served on the council, planning commission, budget committee, and design review board before his election as mayor. I'm always at a loss to know where the heart of Beaverton is, but heart or not, it has close to 70,000 people in it these days. Prior to becoming mayor, Rob had 15 years in management and sales. He serves at this time in close to 20 committees in the Beaverton and metropolitan area. Gentlemen, is there any hope for salmon, and at what cost? Bill?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the chance to be here. Salmon and the city. What's the best investment? how do we answer that question as a community? Science. Well, we need science to help. Science tells us that salmon need different things and at different life stages and at different places. Portland has just initiated a study of salmon needs along the Willamette River. That's good news. What salmon need in streams and in rivers is different than what they need. What they need in streams is different than what they need in rivers, and it's different at a juvenile life stage and at an adult life stage. But science is rarely absolute and usually leads to more questions. For example, the science tells us that once we remove the forest and create impervious surfaces like roofs and roads, we change the flows in streams to a point that we see drastic declines in wild salmon, and we don't know how to get them back. This leaves us with a question. If we have limited funds to invest in salmon habitat, where's the best return on our investment? In urban streams or in rural streams? I believe we must ask and answer these questions about return on investment before we invest large amounts of effort and money that we are likely to invest in response to the Endangered Species Act. There are lots of different opinions about what the science tells us about these questions. So we depend on the public debate to deal with the uncertainties of science. Both science and public debate are needed. Both are interdependent. Public debates leads to public policy. Public policy is a hypothesis. Science can test that hypothesis and tell us how well it is working. That leads to more public debate. But our public institutions are not set up to conduct debate and make decisions at a watershed scale. We make most watershed decisions at a local scale. Well, what do the salmon need? Let's take a look at those issues from the viewpoint of a salmon. I'm a salmon. I left home at a very young age and went out to sea. Now I'm coming home. I'm big, I'm strong, I'm fast, and I need some action. I have a feeling that if I get home in time, I just might get lucky. So I'm going to swim like crazy, and if I'm not blocked by dams or culverts or get caught in a net, I'll get home. Well, here I am, sure enough, back in a stream. This feels familiar and looks like a good stretch of gravel. Oh, there's a female over there building a nest. I think I'll wander over there and see if she's responsive. She's strong enough to move gravel and build a nest to let our eggs fall into. That way, when our babies hatch, they can hide in the gravel until they're strong enough to swim in the current. So the gravel will protect the babies unless some high flows cause erosion and bury the eggs in silt. I'm a little nervous about that because when I look around, I see the forest is gone and it's been replaced by roads and lawns. You see, removing even a little forest and building even small amounts of impervious surface cause changes in stream flows. If there's less than 65% of the forest and more than 10% of impervious surface, the stream flows change enough to really damage my stream and kill most of my eggs. And all of your scientists and all of your engineers don't know how to change that or fix it once the trees are gone. Well, I'm excited. Some of my eggs hatched, made it to spring, and now the little guys are swimming out into the gravel, out of the gravel. Look, they need to find a place quickly where they can hide and rest. Where are the pools that used to be here? We need logs to form pools, and we need bushes to hide under. Then we can rest in the pools and eat the bugs and other food that drift down from the gravel reaches. Now they're teenagers, and they think they're big enough to go out on their own. So they're going to swim out into the rivers and downstream. Whoa, who are these big thugs here trying to eat them? What's a bass doing here? They don't belong here. Where can the little salmon hide in the river? The side channels have been blocked off and diked. The river banks are covered with rock. They still need pools and side channels to hide in and rest and eat and grow. But those pools have been blocked or eliminated. There's a lot of problems here, we salmon. So we salmon have gotten together, and we decided it's time to come talk to you humans. We've written a list of our demands, and we want to know who to talk to. Well, who do we talk to? You see, we know what we need, but we figured out that we can't have everything back the way it was. We know there's too many people here now for that. So we want to work with you to figure out where the best place to work is. So again, who do we talk to? How do you humans make decisions? It seems you've got a lot of federal agencies and state agencies and counties and cities and tribes that all make decisions that change our watersheds. But who's in charge? Well, these are the questions we humans have been working on and wrestling with in the Tri-County area now for at least the last 6 or 7 years that I've been involved with it. For example, we have a pretty good idea of what we need to support abundant populations of wild salmon in streams. 65% forest cover, 10% impervious surface or less, 60% of the riparian corridor protected in natural conditions. If these things are not in place, we see drastic declines in the biology, including salmon populations. We know that our mitigating measures like detention ponds and stream restoration are good things, but the science tells us they don't make much difference in salmon populations. We believe, therefore, that the best return on investment for wild salmon for streams may be in rural areas. But how do we use money from urban areas to protect and enhance habitat in rural areas? In King County, salmon habitat is managed by many state and federal agencies, at least half a dozen tribes, 39 cities, and 3 counties. But no one is in charge. We've worked hard to get the jurisdictions to cooperate, but they don't trust each other. When we started, they weren't even too happy about meeting together. And they're not likely to share power or revenues willingly. After all, we have cities because the cities' citizens weren't happy with the services they got from the county. And there are a lot of very difficult and unpopular issues that these jurisdictions must debate. In King County, we've identified and evaluated options for making decisions, many of them. The most popular and most promising are the watershed forums. In 1996, we formed watershed forums made up exclusively of elected officials from each of the cities and the counties in each watershed. This was one of the first forums where elected officials could meet and discuss regional issues on an equal basis. These forums agreed that solving issues like flooding, water quality, and fish habitat require a regional approach. And they adopted a set of regional funding principles. Those principles define what services should be funded regionally and which services should remain local. Then along came ESA and the listing of Chinook. Our 4D draft rule requires development of watershed plans. The watershed plans will identify where the best investments in salmon habitat are, how much we should invest, and how the costs will be shared among the cities, counties, state, and federal governments. But no mechanisms for enforcing the plan have been identified. So the ultimate success of our efforts to recover wild salmon remain a big question. So while we've made a lot of progress, we've learned a lot and had some great successes, we still have some things to work out. So in closing, I'll leave you with these 4 thoughts on the challenges still before us. Salmon need different things at different life stages and at different locations. We are severely limited in what we can accomplish in urban streams for wild salmon. This raises the question, where do we get the best return on investment on our limited funds, in urban or in rural areas, in our streams or in our rivers? What institutional structures do we have to make these decisions and to share funding between jurisdictions in a watershed? I believe we'll find the answers to these questions, but we've still got some work to do. Thank you.
Well, since Lloyd mentioned my colleagues, I wanted to take 30 seconds, if I could, to introduce my colleague, Councilor Round Park from the Gresham area, and also offer, if people are going to have questions, feel free to ask him a little later. What I wanted to talk about a little bit, I wanted to talk about more about human nature than about Mother Nature. The Endangered Species Act is a test of physical science, as we've heard, but I think it's also a test of that most unscientific of sciences, political science. In my opinion, we're failing that test. The physical science of fish, zoology, hydrology, that's all mysterious, it's incomplete, but to a large extent, it's there in some form or another. And what's often missing is the political science and the willingness to apply that physical science. It's kind of a cliche that ESA is about native species struggle to survive, and we hear that. But in my book, ESA is also the story of our own species challenge to build new public institutions that are capable of transcending the boundaries of old human institutions. So I'll spare the poetry about Lewis and Clark and the cliches that we hear about salmon being the icon of the Northwest. I want to go straight to the point, and that is, I think, the need to reshape government to fit the scope of problems, rather than just be confined by the arbitrary jurisdictional boundaries that were drawn in the 1850s. The question really isn't the adaptability of fish. I mean, we know already there are limitations to that adaptability. The question now, I think, is the adaptability of humans and human institutions. Unfortunately, those have limitations as well. And I think the salmon and the steelhead are failing biologically in part because we humans are failing organizationally. Let's talk about human organizations a little bit before we talk about fish. And what we learn from successful organizations of all types today is that organizations that are nimble, that consolidate, deconsolidate, spin off, create interdisciplinary teams, and work in non-hierarchical fashion, those are the organizations that succeed today. By contrast, organizations that are structured pretty much the way they were structured in 1950, let alone 1850, those are the organizations that fail generally. The examples are all around us in all types of world. The collapse and rebirth of U.S. Steel, life cycles out at Tektronix, the demise of cumbersome Japanese banks. Now at Intel, they've got a culture called creative confrontation, and they combine engineers with marketers, assembly managers. They all come together and they achieve results. Out at Nike, Phil Knight's got this somewhat inelegant but accurate term called the butt-face meetings, where he throws together financiers with athletes, with chemists, with designers. They come together and they achieve results. And downtown here, the Pearl District, the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, they erase all those boundaries between dance, drama, and drawing. So what's the lesson of that? The lesson of that in the organizational world today is that agility wins, rigidity loses. Collaboration leads to success. Archaic turf jealousies lead to failure. Well, which of those two organizational models do we want to apply to government in Oregon today? That's the lesson. What does this have to do with fish? It is that successful organizations today share three important characteristics. They cross traditional boundaries and disciplines. They do something new that nobody else, no other organization does, and they add value. And the something new and the value that they add is not necessarily a uniform one-size-fits-all kind of product. In fact, most of the time, it's quite the opposite. But however different those products are, they all conform to a high standard and they achieve a consistent outcome. That's the kind of organization that I'd like Metro to be. These principles relate to fish because like markets or like capital or like ideas, fish cross those traditional jurisdictional boundaries. The distinction between Beaverton and Tigard is lost on a steelhead. However, they do know the difference between Fano Creek and Tryon Creek better than we humans do, even though parts of those creeks are in the same human jurisdictions. Now, their lives are affected by a range of our activities, not covered by any one governmental department. They're affected by our land use, they're affected by our transportation networks, by our agriculture, by the way we fertilize our lawns, and by what happens when we flush the toilets here in the Multnomah Club on some rainy days. In technical terms, fish are multi-jurisdictional, multidisciplinary critters. The question is, are we, are humans? Another thing for certain is that fish defy traditional bureaucracies. That's been obvious over the past few years. But the next question is, can we Can we defy those? Can we get beyond those? The answer to those questions, I'm afraid, is not yet. And that's the human nature part of it. Luckily, evolution's not finished with us yet either. Now, in theory, the Portland area has a unique opportunity to address this regional issue because we have Metro, an agency of regional scope. In reality, we're failing to capitalize on that unique opportunity. While the fish are experiencing biological failure, we humans are committing political failure. 4 observations from my past year and a half at Metro. First, there should be no question that urban and suburban settlement has an enormous impact on habitat. The fact that logging and agriculture upstream and seals and Arctic terns downstream also have an impact on fish doesn't absolve us from responsibility from doing what we can in our region. And to point fingers elsewhere and stall by just asking for more science, well, that's a tactic that's more befitting of the Tobacco Institute than it is of Oregonians. Secondly, the scientific information is never complete, and it is mysterious. But there are some things that we do know. We can and should focus on our work on what we do know, and not just procrastinate about the many things that, admittedly, we don't know. My third observation would be that if fish and wildlife are not regional issues, then what are? Johnson Creek runs through multiple jurisdictions, unincorporated parts of Clackamas County, Multnomah County, Portland, Milwaukee, Gresham. And now its problems, the problems of Johnson Creek are not going to be fixed by any one of those jurisdictions working in isolation. But at the same time, Johnson Creek has peculiar characteristics that are not shared by the Clackamas River or the Tualatin River or Fano Creek. We can look for those similarities and respect the differences in our approach to it. We can affirm that all streams are regionally significant. Now, that's a view that is strenuously opposed by some people, but we can also say that each of them have different functions and values and treated accordingly. Fourth observation would be that National Marine Fisheries Service's draft rules sent strong signals that a regional response would be received more favorably than piecemeal actions. Localities subscribing to a regional set of standards would basically go to the head of the line. For them, signing off on it, for the feds, signing off on a coherent set of regional standards makes a lot more sense than having a federal bureaucrat scrutinize every building permit issued by every jurisdiction as they come along. And from our point of view, at the region's point of view, unified standards provide a legal shield against accusations of violations of the Act. A local official recently described NIMP's rules to me as vague but strict, and I think perhaps those are the two scariest words in the regulatory universe, unless they start using cruel and unusual. But even my 7-year-old nephew will tell you that vague regulation, vague rules may be okay, and strict rules may be okay, but rules that are simultaneously vague and strict are pretty scary. It's difficult to satisfy and punitive if you don't. I'd like to think that a regional plan could bring some clarity to that vague, but also create a shield against the strict. So, what to do? What do these 4 observations tell me? The observations, we know that urban and suburban settlement patterns have an impact on fish. Science tells us what some of those impacts are, and the issue is regional but has sub-regional characteristics. And 4, that the federal government's more likely to bless us if we present a unified regional front, and would be more likely to hold up projects if we don't. Now, given those common sense observations, why are we even having this debate? And why have we at Metro failed to earn support for a regional response? And why are some folks so adamantly against one? The first explanation is implied by my own acceptance of our responsibility, Metro's failure to earn support. And I will take some responsibility for that failing, and I'm going to continue to take responsibility for trying to turn it around. We need to show, and I think we can, that collectively we can develop an approach that's based on outcomes and high standards, not solely on one-size-fits-all prescriptions. And while it's never easy and it's never popular to be a regulator, and we are a regulator, not a popular thing all the time, a regulator also needs to constantly remind the public of the value of that regulation, and that's an important and appropriate role for us to play. If we shrink from doing it, we're not doing the job that we were elected to do. Moreover, we need to be adding value and think of ourselves as conveners and coordinators as well as regulators, because nobody has all the answers to this, least of all us. There's a great amount of technical expertise all around the region residing in different jurisdictions, and Metro can and will provide the table where expertise is shared and compared and improved upon. But if Metro is responsible for some of the failure to craft a coherent regional response, a large part of the failure is also shared outside of our building. There are those who drag their feet asking for more science. There are those who pretend that streams begin and end at city-county boundaries and who say that waterways are not regional resources, but somehow highways and convention centers are. Well, these are all variations on a theme of denial, and those sort of jurisdictional prerogatives are as great a hazard to fish these days as culverts are. If we were at Intel, if we were at the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, we might use that tension and conflict to create innovative solutions, and instead, a lot of the time in government, the dreary mantras of consensus and process actually anesthetize us. Finally, our biggest obstacle is the fact that what needs to be done is not very easy to do. There are powerful interests who don't want anything to be done, but dealing with the well-intentioned majority is no picnic either. We eagerly slap Save the Earth bumper stickers on our cars, but we're not so eager to drive those cars less. We tell pollsters we care about fish, but we tell the city council that our sewer bills are too high. Private property owners are not at all enthralled at having their construction rights regulated near streams, and clearly their constitutional rights needed to be upheld. If we don't uphold them, the courts are certainly going to do it for us. Voters, and 87% of you, voted against a gas tax increase this week, are probably not thrilled at the idea that somebody says $32 million is needed in this area to fix culverts rather than fixing potholes. These are hard things to do. But ultimately, that's the sort of civic engagement that's going to determine our success or the failure of the metro area's response to this federal law. We've shaped the landscape for long generations, and now we need to reshape our institutions to deal with the consequences. That means not just reversing biology, but it also means reversing what's today's saddest political truth, which is that while public passion for community and environment is very high, public faith in the government organizations that serve those very same ends is ironically low. To restore the fish, we got to first restore credibility to those institutions. That's the federal government, the state, metro, local cities and counties, all of us at all levels. Restoring that relevance requires the agility and creativity and the willingness that other organizations in other spheres of our society demonstrate, that willingness and ability to cross meaningless old boundaries. I'll do my part to help Metro change into that type of organization. And if we succeed, our legacy will not just be more fish, but our legacy will be a regional government that's adept and collaborative at solving problems, inspiring the best in human nature in the service of Mother Nature. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Being about the only Democratic mayor in Washington County, it's nice to occasionally come to Portland and not have to look over my shoulder. I'm also here to confess that I grew up in Irvington on 17th between Siskiyou and Klickitat, but please don't tell anyone in Washington County. I did live in a dense neighborhood, and I'm old enough to have ridden the trolley out to Oaks Park in the mid-1950s. And my friend Charlie Hales thinks he invented the trolley. Yeah. While members of the City Club and government officials like me are heavily engaged in the discussions of ESA and Goal 5 processes, the average citizen in Beaverton and Washington County is not so well informed. Only recently are citizens and businesses becoming aware of the potential impacts on their properties and limitations for future development. We know that opinion polling in the region shows strong support for and encourages good environmental regulation and habitat protections. I do support such protections and encourage consensus building and sound policies that are appropriate in an urban setting that is shaped by 2040 plan policies and densities. Governmental agencies in Washington County have strong working relationships and a desire to find common ground on issues. While it isn't always a love fest out there, we do have great respect for one another and prefer not airing dirty linen in public. Our citizens demand efficient, effective government and don't like infighting and being territorial. We have a job to do and we do it. We have found common ground and one ordinance in adopting Metro's Title III. We can do the same thing with responses to ESA and Goal 5 requirements. Generally, I've been a strong supporter of Metro. I like that all agencies sit at one regional table and problem solve together. The days of 1 or 2 800-pound gorillas are over, and there is a strong desire regionally to solve problems and move on to the next issue. Besides, we have far more issues to resolve than we have time, and we can't be bickering over who is going to be pulling the train. Portland and Metro have been gracious in sharing the reins, and I think the results have been positive and effective. The issues facing the region are very, very big and demand everyone's best attention. Guiding the rubber raft through the shark-infested waters of ESA and Goal 5 requirements will take patience, preparation, good listening skills, and a willingness to be open-minded. We have very strong competing interests and desires in advocating for a tight urban form and higher densities, limited boundary expansion, saving farm and forest lands, saving fish runs, keeping a healthy economy, and maintaining our livability. Woo, that is a lot to do in one region. But I believe our region can balance these interests and continue to have it all and maintain our highly regarded livability. The ultimate guidelines for ESA and Goal 5 must allow for flexibility and maximum use of available lands, while also recognizing that our valuable riparian and habitat resources must be protected and improved. The Portland region is an urban environment, and for that reason, it is highly unlikely that waterways will ever return to their original natural condition. However, we can improve how we now handle storm runoff, water filtering, protection of waterways, and maintaining corridors for wildlife. I have another concern. While we can likely implement rules that will allow for reasonable use of private and public lands, we need to be careful that we're not reaching too far in taking of people's land and restricting reasonable use of private properties. Well, what I wouldn't want to happen is a broad sweeping lawsuit and subsequent legal decision that would negate the current gains in habitat protections. We are making good strides, and I would encourage patience and sound public processes in arriving at a decision that soundly protects our waterways and habitats for generations to come. As recently as December in Washington County, Unified Sewerage Agency required that new development maintain a 25-foot buffer along waterways. In January, through implementation of Title III requirements, the distance increased to 50 feet. The proposed ESA and Goal 5 draft rules are suggesting and proposing up to a general 200-foot buffer for new or modified development. Though there does appear to be some broadly worded variations to that 200-foot buffer suggestion, the general theme is still strongly encouraging the greater 200-foot protection zone. The exception process is not yet defined and is too important to leave to the trust us process and timeline. This is where the rub begins generally for Washington County jurisdictions. Simply put, this may be too big a bite in an urban setting. At its 200-foot maximum, this is an 8-fold increase in buffer in less than a year. My heart is with good environmental regulation and protection for our remaining wildlife in our urban setting. I'm not certain that the 200-foot distance is realistic and practical. I believe that more analysis and work needs to be done that can provide flexibility and preservation for people's right to maximize the use of their properties and also best utilize the land we have remaining within the urban growth boundary. As ESA and Goal 5 requirements and boundaries are being defined, we also need to carefully evaluate just how far-reaching the regulations will go. In an urban environment with a tight boundary, it doesn't appear feasible to require the same maximum setbacks for ditches, intermittent streams, and non-salmonid waterways. This may work where streams were culverted years back, but it won't work well in Washington and Clackamas counties where we have numerous open waterways. Simply put, Washington County will go out of business. Metro can and should be a partner in helping define ESA and Goal 5 requirements and implementation strategies. However, and of course I've lost my spot here on my last page, let me find it. However, Unified Sewerage Agency, Washington County government, and the jurisdictions in the county are likely to forge our own ordinances responding to and meeting federal ESA and state Goal 5 mandates. The Tualatin River Basin covers far more area than Metro's jurisdiction, and it would be inappropriate for Metro to coordinate the code process for Washington County. As a matter of fact, Metro's legal jurisdiction covers only 5% of the Tualatin River Basin. In closing, it is fair to say that Washington County government and its jurisdictions are enthusiastic about effective and balanced environmental regulations. The issues surrounding ESA and Goal 5 are challenging and certainly very complex. We have a keen interest in working as partners regionally with Metro and other jurisdictions to ensure solid riparian and habitat preservation while also fully and effectively using our land within the urban growth boundary. I want to finish on a little lighter note with one further thought. That's a quote from the famous gangster Al Capone. He said, "You can accomplish more with a kind word and a gun than with a kind word alone." I'm hoping we can use the kind word and not the gun. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jane Cease, and I chaired the committee that put together what we call the Fish Report, and we call it the Fish Committee too. So I think you can see from the comments, we're not talking about an easy task here, and I would like to ask Mayor Drake and Councilor Bragdon to each give us some specific actual steps that each of you will take in your own jurisdiction or in the region to work toward a watershed solution, and then a solution to save salmon. And then I would like to ask Mr. Derry to risk his life and step into the fray to comment on what he thinks the likely success of those steps might be.
Doesn't matter to me. Go down this way. Sure.
Well, first of all, I don't think we're as far apart as we probably sound, but I do think that we can, at least in Washington County, look at the ASA and Goal 5 issues on a watershed basis, but do so in coordination with Metro, who I think is the logical choice in the urban setting. Metro does cross multi-jurisdictional boundaries, and taking what we come up with in Washington County and then linking that with what the rest of the region does, I think we can solve that issue, and I think we can come up with something that is good for everyone. We did that on Title III, and it took a great deal of work, but we did it. And other parts of the country aren't doing a lot of the things we're doing, and I think the region deserves a pat on the back. When you look at the work we've done on affordable housing and the 2040 process, the functional plan, people are coming through all the time wanting to know what is it you're doing that's different in other parts of the country. And I use the word or the phrase, it's not always a love fest in Washington County. Well, obviously, regionally, it's not always a love fest, but there's very little, if any, real bickering or any real animosity toward one another politically. We may disagree on a given day on an issue, but I don't see it carried over to the next meeting. And I think that's the key to success. So I'm hopeful that when we get through discussing what, I guess, the science and how the science applies to an urban setting, and we do our work in Washington County as the others are doing it, we do this in a parallel path, I think we can arrive at a good solution.
You want us to just take these from here? You asked in terms of what we'd be doing at our jurisdiction, and I divide that up a couple of ways. One, more broadly, fish and wildlife habitat is part of land use planning and part of what was envisioned with 2040. People think of 2040 as involving light rail and redevelopment of town centers. It is that, but it also very much in the minds of people who participated in developing it includes a component of fish and wildlife habitat. So when we talk about it in terms of the land use planning, we've been working on that in terms of an attempt to coordinate with the local jurisdictions. I think the mayor's correct. I think there is a lot more room to work together than we've always been able to achieve, but we're getting there. On the protective stream riparian areas, for example, there is a draft that we've got out right now that's been being discussed that does talk about a 200-foot management zone with certain types of activities either modified or prohibited depending on how the tax lots are configured. I think the mayor's quite right that we need to refine that further, and what I'd ask is that that people who are experts in this, and includes people at the Unified Sewerage Agency in Washington County as well as the City of Portland, help to define exactly what that management area is and what alternatives there are to it in terms of performance standards and outcomes. So I think that's a very important thing that we need to be doing and that we are doing in the land use kind of regulatory arena. Two other things that we are undertaking, and I think very successfully in one instance, which is the acquisition of sites, which thanks to the voters in 1995 who passed a $135 million bond levy, we are acquiring sites that have been designated by biologists, whether it's Audubon Society or Tualatin River Keepers, other groups like that, identified in a master plan as being of particular value, and a surprising number, right near the 6,000 acre mark, and a pretty healthy proportion of that is along streams, along sensitive streams, as well as along the Willamette River, for that matter. So public acquisition of those sites is important. Then the final point, I think, is to marshal and coordinate the good things that already are happening, because here again, I want to agree with the mayor that there are good things happening everywhere, and a lot of the time we benefit from sharing that. And again, I would refer to the Unified Sewerage Agency in Washington County that's ahead of everybody else as far as I hear in terms of erosion control methods. There may be things that Troutdale or Gladstone can learn from that, and there's probably something that somebody else can learn from Troutdale and Gladstone. So I think Metro's a place where we can have those discussions as well.
You're next.
Okay. Can we protect and recover everything everywhere? No. As Lloyd said, one of the things I did for Tri-County was write the background paper for adaptive management. And one of the quotes I love that came from the guy that invented the term in environmental situations was that adaptive management has floundered in complex institutional settings. Well, after I delivered that presentation to a workshop in September, they started calling me Dr. Doom. Will the specific mechanisms and actions we're proposing today meet all the expectations? No. But there's too much effort going on. There's too many people who care deeply about this that are investing a lot of energy out there to not succeed. So, will they be successful? Yes. Not exactly the way we think we will be, but yes, we'll get there.
Paddy Tillett, City Club member. A lot of what you've talked about and the 12 guidelines that have been put together to help us implement the new legislation all seem to address streams that are in outer urban areas. When one comes to look at a stream like the Willamette River in downtown Portland, one's really at a loss to see how one can begin to conform. There's no way that the wide mud flats on either side of the river are going to be restored through downtown, nor, I suspect, is there any way that a 200-foot swath down either side of the river is going to be accepted as undevelopable. How do you think we should address that sort of truly urban circumstance?
Bill?
I sat in a basement room at the University of Washington with a group of scientists last Friday discussing this issue. And the first issue, we all seem to say, well, yeah, we need a different look for urban settings. And the science that's out there is mostly for streams, not rivers. The science behind the buffer setbacks. And it's mostly in wild environments. And so the application of that in an urban setting is problematic, obviously. The first question we're trying to identify is the defining urban. Where do we draw that line? If we accept the premise that there should be a different approach in urban areas, what's urban? And we haven't even answered that yet. And if there's a 200-foot setback for a stream, what's an appropriate setback for a river? I think it's less clear there. Rivers tend to be tremendously productive at more localized places, like inside channels, not uniformly along the river necessarily. So I think there are some serious questions about whether a uniform approach to a buffer along a river through an urban area is supportable by the science. Perhaps we need to figure out where those really productive complexes of habitat are along the river and focus on those as opposed to a blanket requirement.
Here's a question from a written question then. How can the city of Portland's and Metro's resources be best used to help wild salmon, invest in restoring urban streams in the city, or to protect intact habitat areas such as those in Clackamas County?
I wanted to also just touch on Patty's question as well, because I think these are related actually. One is that you start where you are. You're not necessarily, you can't start where in pre-Lewis and Clark times, and that you look at different needs and different applications in different places. Downtown Portland, downtown Beaverton is actually the same thing. Downtown Oregon City is the same in that they are redevelopment areas or areas that are already developed. And so to impose a 200-foot uniformity in any of those situations is actually detrimental to the cause. I mean, it's not doesn't achieve anything. Especially you have a site like North Macadam, where you actually want to make things better, and where imposing that sort of 200-foot is going to prevent anything from happening and leave the status quo. So I think tailoring the regulations in that way is the way you try to achieve that. It's not easy to do, but that's why we need to have the conversation. The second question is basically a question of allocating resources in one area as opposed to another. Again, I think that you need to go watershed by watershed and site by site and try to do the most effective thing in each area, and there's not a uniform answer to that.
Rob, did you have any comment?
Not really. Okay.
John Fruing, City Club member. I want to follow up on Jane's request on some specifics. Would you address the feasibility or the practicality of making a simple change like in building permits using a prospective 100-year floodplain boundary as opposed to a historic 100-year floodplain? I make reference to a recent situation in the Washington Square regional development planning where Washington Square happens to occupy the lower stretch or is near the lower stretch of Ash Creek and Fano Creek confluence, but there was no consideration given to changes in upstream or the top of the watershed land use changes in the next 100 years that are allowed by various city and regional plans. So what is the feasibility of changing from a historic 100-year floodplain to a prospective 100-year floodplain given the land use plans that we have now, and would that help?
I'll comment about that. Our city hall is in the historic 100-year floodplain, as is Sailor's Old Country Kitchen, if you know downtown Beaverton at all. Fred Meyer parking lot, and on and on and on. Some of that area was culverted. I think we need to recognize, and that's part of my comments, and David and I have talked about the regional centers. 200 feet in downtown Beaverton would retard development. I've already heard that from the property owners. Nothing would happen. And if we're going to reshape our downtown and be able to answer Lloyd's question, where is our downtown, And many people have asked that too. I know where it is, but like Richard Nixon, and remember he had his little plan and he wasn't going to divulge it until the election. Now that I'm reelected, I'll divulge it here in the next week. I'm just kidding. You're supposed to laugh at that point. But I think it does make sense to take what we currently have today and accept that we are where we are in some situations and look for ways to mitigate elsewhere and or improve what we have. And in looking at our downtown and even Portland's downtown, Tualatin, Oregon City, that is urban development. But what can we do to make that existing situation better than it is? And when it is redeveloped, what can we require / encourage for mitigation? We're already looking at that in our downtown and looking at potential places where we could expand out Beaverton Creek, improve it, build some of these side areas and clean water storage and enhance and improve those and still get the kind of redevelopment that we're looking at in our core. We are where we are today. This is the year 2000, and as David said, we can't go back to pre-Lewis and Clark days. It just won't happen. But how can we make what we have better and also deal with other areas that are somewhat natural and improve those?
Well,
I'm going to go ahead, and then I've got a question here.
A couple of quick ones. The urban versus rural. I'd like to just put a question back to you. If we say we need to, the best investment is in rural, protecting what's good already, how do we take funding from urban areas to help those people? After all, it's not fair to ask them, okay, you set aside yours because we've already damaged ours. So we need to work with them in partnership. On the question of prospective versus historic, I did a flood plan with Snohomish County and the city of Bothell where the floodplain expanded because of urban development. The peak flows had increased because of urban development over 25 years. And FEMA came in and remapped, and the developer had to raise levees and set aside additional land for the floodplain. They were less than supportive of FEMA's actions. But that's one example of an impact there.
Dan?
Dan Goldie, as I listened to you, I thought of how someone from Eastern Oregon or Southern Oregon might be reacting to what you've said. When you talk about the problems of a 200-foot buffer here in the urban area and realize that NIMFS, the Marine Fisheries Service, has proposed 300-foot buffers. I mean, they want to impose them on not only rivers, but streams, creeks, rivulets, every damp place in the coastal forests, so that to the people who utilize those forests, they say there's nothing left. 80%, 90% is now a riparian area if you do that. Now, the question I have is this. Will go into political science, Dave, from the science. Will the problems that you're wrestling with and talking about today in the urban areas develop a sensitivity in the urban population that will make it possible for the urban part of this state and the rural part of this state to begin to come together and recognize a common set of problems instead of everybody, as you said, Bill, saying the problem ought to be solved just in the rural areas? And can we hope then for a solution that is statewide or region-wide?
Let me start with that. Let's answer that first in the context of the federal law, because I think that's as distinct from state law. You know, if you were sitting in Oak Ridge or Roseburg or Hines, you know, you'd probably be chuckling at the idea of the city slickers now having to deal with this stuff when we were very smug about having them deal with their issues. Under the federal law, economics really don't have the kind of standing in making these balancing choices that we do make under the state law. So I think that's why we need to be very careful and have that shield against litigation in terms of the federal law, in terms of justifying variations, whether it's for redevelopment or other factors, that it has to also have some muster in terms of the environmental protection. I'm thinking of North Macadam, for example. You can't just say, well, you know, we know that we screwed up, or that the Douglas County's economy is screwed up because of the spotted owl, but we still want to be able to build condos because we want to be able to shop at the Gap under the Ross Island Bridge. We have to be saying redevelopment actually benefits the situation environmentally as well as economically to satisfy the federal law. And I think you're right that by working through those sorts of things, there may be more mutual understanding among different parts of the state.
Bill, here's a question. You mentioned great successes in the Tri-County area. That's in the King County, Pierce, and Snohomish County area. Could you give us a few examples? You mentioned one earlier.
I think first and foremost, I would say the forums, the watershed forums. And that truly was the first time many of the elected officials could come together at a table and talk on an equal basis and really come to agreement without the threat of one having power over the other. And they did adopt a set of regional principles and agree, okay, this is local, this is regional, and the key issues of flooding and fish habitat and water quality, there was broad agreement. We have to work together. And working together means sharing money. So they did officially adopt regional funding principles. I think a tremendous amount has been learned in the last few years, and I think the effort that's gone into the 4D rule has produced a great document. I think there's still a lot of questions that we have to answer, but I think we're so far ahead of where we were a few years ago in terms of addressing the issues. Those are some of the successes. And the very discussion that we're having today, and the fact that we can no longer act independently. Not only do neighboring cities have to talk, but those cities have to be talking to the rural people too. It has to be a partnership across the board.
Without considering whether it could be done, is it time for Metro to expand to cover the metropolitan area, if not the world?
Yeah,
I think David should answer.
You know, I think, well, let's talk about North Interstate Light Rail. You know, it's a lot better to be asked to do things and have people show that feel like you're adding some value to their lives, and than to impose yourselves. So you know, if people in Pendleton want to be part of Metro, I haven't heard from them yet. So.
What about actually in the metropolitan area, boundaries expanding?
Well, I mean, I think what makes sense is that our jurisdiction should fit the size of the problem, and that I think it does these days in terms of where urban areas are. We have good intergovernmental agreements on things that matter with places nearby. Sandy, for example, North Plains, they're not in our jurisdiction, but we have a good discussion with them on issues that affect each other. So I don't see any need to expand.
Susan Stone, member of the club. We've talked a lot about working together. One of the things the local governments have already done is put together approved Goal 5 plans. What happens to those plans if Metro does its own Goal 5 plan?
Well, under the state's Goal 5, you know, under Senate Bill 100, for those of you who don't know all the archaic details, Senate Bill 100 led to several goals, or nearly 20 goals, a lot of which conflict with one another. That's the nature of land use planning in Oregon. There's one for orderly urbanization, and there's one for protection of fish and wildlife habitat. There's one for protection of farmers. So it's a balancing act. Under the Goal 5 rules, there's a recognition by Land Conservation and Development Commission that in the urban area, those are sort of a patchwork that were done at different times and have different degrees of protection in different places. Those don't go away as we do a regional Goal 5.